They interrupted Days of Our Lives and Judge Judy for that. I'm sure that's what some people in Pittsburgh maybe were screaming and maybe calling the local television station saying, because, well, that wasn't the best of football games that anybody could be watching. Sloppy definitely is a word, but nonetheless, after a week plus of a journey to get to this point, the Pittsburgh Steelers managed to get the job done yet again, and the Pittsburgh Steelers managed to pick up yet another victory, this one over the Baltimore Ravens. So they accomplish what their goal was. We now are going to discuss the journey to get to this point, the game, the sloppy game that it was, and the victory for the Pittsburgh Steelers as they now move to 11-0 on the season after beating Baltimore 19-14. I'm your host here, Mike Asti, and I'm going to be joined alongside by our Cale Berger as we take you across our Steelers Now version of Steelers Postgame here on Pittsburgh Sports Live. I want to remind you, bottom of the video, if you're either here live or watching this archive on our sites or channel, make sure to hit that subscribe button to make it easier for us to get the content to you. It's actually free to do so. So I see no reason why you don't. And Cale, to get us started here, the Steelers got the win. It was ugly early on, certainly. There was a while in this game, I think I was wishing that I maybe was watching Judge Judy. Yeah. And hopefully for NBC's sake, that they get that entertainment value they were hoping on that decision they made to have that tree lighting be their prime time event, because odds are probably in favor of that being more entertaining than this game. The Steelers, though, do get the victory. They turn it on a little bit towards the end. They kind of find their footing, but it certainly wasn't pretty throughout this game. The Ravens well undermanned, and we got to see Trace McSorley throw a touchdown pass in the National Football League. So that was kind of amazing in and of itself. But just generally here as we open things up, what are your takeaways? And I'm sure you have many of them from the Steelers now being 11-0 in what I got to say, it's been an asinine season, an asinine year in our world. This absolutely has been the most asinine week for any other NFL team.
Exactly. That's a perfect way to describe it. And first of all, Mike, thanks for having me on this evening. Happy to discuss this game as the Steelers go 11-0, like you said. And yeah, you know, this game had to forego Judge Judy. It had to be slotted in prior to the Christmas tree lighting in New York City. Obviously not as pretty as the Christmas tree lighting. And in terms of daytime television, it was not as much Judge Judy, more as it was as sloppy as Maury Povich, especially in the early stage of this game, because yeah, I mean, both teams looked like they were supposed to play 6 days ago and had to sit around for 6 days, especially the Ravens offensively, though, you know, they got some things going, especially there in the second half. But the Steelers, too, you know, especially trying to hold on to the football in the passing game. We knew the Steelers were going to come in here and try to throw the football because the running game really hasn't been a focus for them all season. And just early on in this game, a lot of sloppiness all across the board, especially in that receiving core. You can count up the number of drops, and I'm sure we'll get to this a little bit later, but there might have been, 8 or 9 drops on the evening thus far or overall. So sloppiness is the way to put it. I think it was not a pretty game, but like has been the narrative all year, a game that had to be played. You had to get it out of the way. You had to rip the Band-Aid off if you were the Ravens, and if you were the Steelers, you had to stay ready to play this game and get it out of the way. And that's certainly what happened. Is they took care of business, they got it done, they got the win, and they got it over with.
I think that really got to be the message. I'd imagine that's even the message Mike Tomlin might have sent to his players there. I'm sure he's, Alan Saunders over there going to be handling those Zooms tonight. But they get the job done. They get the victory. They accomplish their goal of the individual week, and I'm sure that's what Tomlin's telling his team. I'd also imagine he's also going to tell his team we have some work to do in our short week now until our next game against the Washington football team, which would be another weirdness of schedules and days, that being a 5 p.m.er on Monday. So not too far from that game, and we'll get to the weirdness of the future schedules for these teams in a moment too, because the Ravens have a longer break for their game, which will take place Tuesday night. But I'm sure that's what Tomlin's saying. I'm sure he's saying that we got the win, but I'm sure he's also saying we had a lot of work to do because a lot maybe was exposed in this game that some weren't maybe expecting. However, do you think there's any credence to how asinine the journey was to get to this game and have it be not Ravens week, but Ravens weeks, and have it literally be a week and a half where they went from Thanksgiving night, a holiday night, to Juju all of a sudden able to hand out the turkeys himself, to then going into the weekend and now getting here to where other colleagues of ours across the country are preparing their prep to cover week 13. We are literally discussing week 12 right now, as crazy as that sounds. Did any of that come into play to maybe why this game was so sloppy? They played poorly at times before, but it seemed like exceptionally sloppy, certainly at least among the wide receivers.
I think it definitely played a factor, and I think more so that was the impact on the Ravens. You saw with Robert Griffin III and the running back Gus Edwards and some of their receivers as well. They had no timing in the passing game. They had really no hopes of having any success in the passing game. And then you saw with that fumble in the first quarter where that mesh point and that read option between Gus Edwards and Robert Griffin III, just not the kind of feel, not the kind of continuity that you would normally have with a Lamar Jackson and a Mark Ingram or a J.K. Dobbins or a
Right.
Gus Edwards in there. So little miscommunication in that instance that I thought was just a product of not having the practice time on the field together. They got to do these, 2 walkthroughs over the last 2 days, and that's really about it. But other than that, they haven't been on the field. It's been Zoom calls like we're doing right now, and it's been phone calls. It's been virtual stuff. They haven't even seen each other until they got on the plane and got on the buses yesterday. So I think that especially on the Ravens side is where we saw that the impact of not having that time on the field and just kind of being in that limbo over the last few days. As for the Steelers, I don't know how much I really put credence to that for their sloppiness. There's a lot of things to talk about and to point at in terms of what was sloppy for the Steelers. Chris Boswell missing an extra point is obviously sloppiness, but how much of that is him not having practice time? I think that's just Boz screwing up. I don't think it's
Boz being Boz. We've seen it for years.
Exactly. I don't think it's a matter of him doing anything wrong, really, or not having had reps on the field throughout the week. He's been kicking probably since he came out of the womb. As for the receiving core, these guys have been catching passes from Ben Roethlisberger all year. They're on the same page. They've been playing exceptionally well all season. I don't think it's a matter of not having practice time. I think it was just guys that were trying to do too much at times, maybe, especially, Eric Ebron in the red zone was trying to turn upfield and get to the goal line instead of securing the ball. Deontay Johnson had a few, but that's been the story of Deontay Johnson over his first year and a half in the league is, you love what he does when he's firing on all cylinders. You get upset and make you scratch your head when he drops some of the passes that he's not expected to, or makes routine plays look way more difficult than they need to be. So I don't think anything on the Steelers side was really sloppiness. I think they also had some key guys that were missing, which is another factor we have to put into the mix as well. But I think the sloppiness of the last 6 days and this kind of limbo that everyone was in can really be attributed more to the Ravens than the Steelers. I think the Steelers they ran into a team that still, regardless of who was on the field or not, knows them very well, knows how to push their buttons, and knows how to have success against them.
I think it's also fair to point out that while the Ravens were heavily undermanned entering this game, the one facet of their team that was not as undermanned and has been a great part of their team this year, which has now been a season that's been a large dip, as they've certainly been struggling as of late, is their secondary. So that secondary against the Steelers wide receivers and the amount of times Ben threw the ball, 51 pass attempts in this game, going 36 for 51, it was still a Steeler team that was heavily throwing the football against a pass defense that, generally speaking, is best against the pass. So they maybe were able to neutralize it a little bit. The Steelers receivers didn't help things. The players got kind of their weird wish of getting the equivalent of a bye week back that they lost earlier in the season, but they had a couple practices here or there. I'm sure if Tomlin knew what the schedule was going to be and knew it was going to be Wednesday afternoon a week ago, he would have practiced more. Let's not forget, he practiced up until the announcement, literally the hour of, when they lost that game against Tennessee earlier in the season. And I'm throwing those clips up for us. I know how much this man is practicing. Tomlin is a fan of practicing. So maybe that would have been different had they known the schedule. They did not. They certainly weren't as undermanned as the Ravens, but they did not play their best day. It was certainly good enough for this one. Cale Berger, Mike Asti here on the Steelers edition of Pittsburgh Postgame on Pittsburgh Sports Live. I do see some chatters with us. nothing really of a question sort, other than some statements here. That was ugly, that was awful, but a win is a win. 11-0. And yeah, I think that's going to be a message that Mike Tomlin is absolutely going to tell his team. But of course, he treats it each week individually, as you know, Cale. So I'm sure he's also going to tell his team they need to be much better. They can't do that in future weeks. And
sure,
I'm sure even going to the Dallas game, 2 out of the last 3 out of the last 4, they've kind of have been sloppy despite getting these victories. And that does include the big win over Cincinnati and how well they played in some of those games mixed in as well. Go Steelers, Juju Claypool.
Mike, I will say this, about the week of practice and the lead up to this game.
Yeah.
With Mike Tomlin and the way that he kind of still gave those guys the days off, they were obviously expected to have a Thanksgiving game and then a little bit of a de facto bye week here, which is what they lost when they had to reschedule the Titans game.
Yeah.
That was something that was going to be very critical for the Steelers. They needed those days off. They needed to get some guys back healthy. They needed those guys to get rested. The number one player that I point to is obviously Joe Hayden, who made a very big impact early in this game with that pick 6. He was a guy that if this game was played on Thursday, probably wouldn't have played.
Maybe Sunday too.
Or Sunday, and would have been very limited. So I think that Mike Tomlin, we're going to say this, I think, the entire rest of the time we're on here, is that a win is a win, and you'll take it any way you can. But I think Mike Tomlin made the right decision here. He didn't throw these guys onto the practice field for 5 days straight and say, well, this game could be played at any time. We need to make sure we're ready to go. He said, listen, okay, this game is going to be played when it's played. We were ready for Thursday. Nothing about our game plan or anything we're going to do is changing. Right. We're just going to continue to execute that game plan whenever this game happens to be played. It was supposed to be Thursday, then it was Sunday, and then now it was Tuesday, then it was Wednesday. I think he was just realizing, all right, this was my plan all along. In the long run, we're going to need this much more than these extra days of practice here to play this opponent that is he assumed and kind of knew was going to be weakened by the time they actually met on the field. I think he made the right decision realizing that for the long haul, they needed those extra days. They needed those to get off their feet a little bit. And I think it will pay off because they have a pretty difficult stretch here to finish out the season.
And we have the nice little back end here helping us out here, Cale, as we're not able to be part of the Zooms because we're doing this Zoom broadcast. We do have the Mike Tomlin quotes right here in our Pittsburgh Sports Live chat. So any of you can read these and chat along and respond to us. And when asked about his team's drops, especially in the end zone, Tomlin basically just admitted that was on us. We weren't good enough, and we sucked. To put it bluntly, I'm not sure that if that was literally what was said, but that was what was thrown there in the chat by our back end team here. And then, to be bluntly honest, Tomlin does go on about being disappointed, but he does say we did enough to win, and that's all. So he does make it clear that they did enough to win, which is the most important thing. They're 11-0, but they didn't do anything more than that. They certainly did not satisfy him. They did enough to win. They did enough to beat an undermanned team that was already on a losing streak and was not riding high by any means.
And I think the other thing, too, to add is that the Ravens weren't the only team in this matchup that was undermanned either. I mean, the Steelers were without Marquise Pouncey. They were out with James Conner. They were without Stefan Tuitt. They were missing key players and guys that were just as crucial to them. Obviously the Ravens without Lamar Jackson, but guys that are just as integral and crucial to the Steelers as the Ravens players that they weren't available or to have today. Yeah. So I think that a lot of people were hoping and wanted some 50-0 blowout of the Ravens. Very rarely does that ever happen in the NFL unless it's the Saints playing the Buccaneers. But I think that's what maybe Steelers fans would have wanted because they've been put through this aggravation along with the team. Everyone was, hey, we'll get our Thanksgiving dinner done around 3:00. We'll eat, we'll take a nap, we'll get ready. And then the game didn't happen on Thanksgiving. Then they were ready for Sunday. That didn't happen. Yeah. Their entire schedule over the last week has been thrown up in the air and chewed up and spit out. Right. And I think there was some frustration there from Steelers fans too. They wanted a blowout, but I think that when you look at who the Steelers didn't have available today and with the opponent, with the familiarity with the opponent, I think you got to be happy with the margin of victory, the win today, and just move on, because I think everyone involved in this situation is ready to just bring on Washington. Like, we're done. Okay. The Steelers have gone 2-0 against the Baltimore Ravens. You can't say that for most years. They're 11-0. Who cares about this last week? Move on.
I don't think I could have said it better myself. Yeah, move on. Granted, we're going to still discuss this game a little bit here. So, but in terms of the fan base, the team, I'm sure that's the message. Just move on, because again, you accomplished the goal. You got the victory, and you got to be done with the chaos that has been this week and get some near sense of normalcy, maybe at least after they would play that Washington football game on Monday at 5 p.m. for another weird one. But I think that got to be the major thing here. Cale Berger, Mike Asti here again, Steelers postgame on Pittsburgh Sports Live. And yeah, it was a very, very odd week. The Steelers certainly were undermanned as well. That's definitely an excellent point to bring up. Obviously, losing your quarterback is going to be the major ding for either one of these two teams.
And a reigning MVP.
Yeah, and reigning MVP. Although I will say, going into this week, prior to knowing anything about COVID, Lamar Jackson was getting criticized heavily for not playing well this season and in big games. This obviously would be a big game.
You're right.
I'm imagining he would have done better than what we saw from RG3, but it's not like him playing would have guaranteed a Ravens victory by any means.
No, not at all. He had not been playing well. You're right. He wasn't lighting the world on fire by any means, and he was not playing. He's not playing all season really at the same level, the same statistical just juggernaut he was last season. He's not doing that this year. And part of that is the league punching back. Part of it, I think, is just, did the Ravens get that much better offensively? You know, they added J.K. Dobbins. Great. You have another running back. But in terms of what they improved upon from last year, they didn't really bolster his receiving core. They lost a tight end in Hayden Hurst, who went to the Falcons. They still have Andrews, who was also out of this game, who was his number one target all year. But I think the biggest, and I don't want to go too in depth here because this is a Steelers post-game show, but I think the biggest problem with Lamar Jackson and what we've seen this year is the Ravens have done a pretty poor job of finding him playmakers, and not in the sense that you just need brand names on the outside. You need guys that can actually make plays for you. You need guys you can get the ball that can take it themselves and go 60 yards. You need guys that can make people miss. And I think when you look at the Ravens, and especially with the way their offense is structured right now, I mean, they're not even getting Hollywood Brown involved at all now.
I was going to say, Hollywood Brown appeared to me, at least, certainly from what I saw in college and thinking going into the draft, he could have been that guy to be your playmaker. That's not happened. To be fair to him, though, he went 4 for 85 with a touchdown and a 70-yarder today. So he did end up with a big play today, did play well today, even with RG3. And they tried to bring in Des Bryant, who they still can't get on the field. They're trying, but they have not found that guy, and Hollywood Brown has not been that guy.
What they need is Des Bryant from about 6 years ago. They need a big body. They need a guy who can go win in contested coverage. And right now they're relying on kind of play action gadget plays to get guys wide open. And that doesn't work in the NFL 100% of the time. It worked last season. It's not going to work all the time. And I think that's the number one thing for the Ravens to address next offseason is get a marquee wide receiver out there for Lamar Jackson. You've seen what DeAndre Hopkins addition has done for Kyler Murray out there in Arizona, how he has just blossomed and having an MVP year. You can go down the list of young quarterbacks in the NFL that do have marquee weapons on the outside and ones that don't. And you can see the way they're trending. Kyler Murray, a guy who is trending way up. Another guy to throw in there is Carson Wentz, who has no weapons, and you see the way he performed the other night. So I think it's all about for the Ravens is getting reliable weapons and guys that can go make a play for you on the outside for Lamar Jackson. But I rest my case. I won't go too any more in-depth on the Ravens offense here into the X's and O's. That's more of a Nick Farabaugh kind of thing, one of our other colleagues at Steelers Now. But yeah, I mean, when you look at what the Steelers did today defensively, I think they did a good job of keeping everything in front of them. One thing I do want to kind of mention here, Mike, in transition is that one of the Steelers' run defense has been largely pretty good all year. One of the few teams that's been able to really give them issues is the Ravens, and they've done it twice now. And I think it's a matter of, it doesn't matter who you have in the backfield or who running the show quarterback. Schematically, they know what they want to do to get to run the ball on the Steelers. I think and I do want to touch on the Steelers' run game like we will in a little bit. And I know from what I've heard, you've talked about this all season, is that when you look at the Steelers' defensive line, they are so thin there that if you lose one guy out of that rotation, it seems like the entire run defense just crumbles in on itself and implodes. And I look at this because I look when they missed Tyson Alualu a few weeks ago. That's when they really started giving up these big gashes in the run game in defensively, was when they missed one guy out of that front three. Now the guy you miss is Stephon Tuitt, and a different position, but still a stout guy on that defensive line, one of your three starters. And you once again see these big gains and you allow a ton of rushing yards. So I don't know if it showed how important Alualu was, but it again is showing just how important that front three is of Tuitt, Alualu, and Hayward, because you lose one of those guys, and in terms of depth, it is not pretty, I guess, in terms of what you have behind them to fill in if those guys are out of the lineup. And that is the thinnest of margins between having a tremendous run defense and having a suspect one for the Steelers.
And that's definitely been a weakness of the Steelers team all season. And one of the positive bits of news we put up on Steelers Now the last couple of days is Stephon Tuitt is supposed to be back for this next week game against the Washington football team, which is not far from now. Again, that's going to be Monday,
according to him,
afternoon, evening. Yeah, so that absolutely has been a major loss. Alualu was a major loss earlier in the season. Cam Hayward coming up lame a couple times, making Steeler fans wince, has been a major
in the
issue
last Ravens game.
Yeah, if he would end up missing time, and he is, on the older side of things. So that is absolutely a weakness that maybe doesn't get discussed enough. People bring up the secondary all the time, but that absolutely is a weakness for this team. Again, Cale Berger, Mike Asti here on the Steelers postgame show here on PSL. Still getting some chat activity here. This will kind of, I guess, because we're going to get to the Steelers running game or lack thereof here in a moment. I also do want to touch on Rod Goodell's comments at halftime as he was brought on to speak to Mike Tirico, who kept his composure, but I felt some sarcasm in some of his responses there, as he's a legend at that. So we'll get to that in a moment as well. But I do want to kind of just ask you this, and this will transition off of something that Chatter is saying. We didn't deserve to win. They played horrible. We should have run the ball more. Basically on and on from several chatters here about they didn't deserve to win. They did get the win nonetheless. But what I do want to ask you here, because we're talking about the defense having some issues still certainly were evident in this game. We're certainly going to get to the issues for the Steelers on the running game for themselves, because that was certainly an issue today, has even been an issue with James Conner. And, who knows about the future of the running game for the Steelers. It's seemingly been an issue no matter who's been in there most of this season. And with the amount they're throwing the ball, they haven't needed it yet, but you figure eventually that might come to roost. And they've not played well in several of these wins. And while they have played well in some other games and certainly deserve to be top power rankings, and they are undefeated, so right now they're in line for the number 1 overall seed, we've seen how well Kansas City has been playing recently. They're the defending champion, so it's that Ric Flair, to be the man, you got to beat the man. And we also have learned, if you're doing a college football playoff ranking quality loss situation, the Chiefs' only loss is not a bad loss anymore like we thought at the time. That's an okay loss to have. They've been playing really well since. They certainly feel like they could beat the Steelers on any given Sunday, Saturday, Tuesday, Wednesday, Thursday, or whenever the hell that game eventually might happen. And I'm sure they'd be favored in the game. And that right now is the goal. We've also talked about in the past on this show that when you get to 10-0, when you get to 9-0, when you're 11-0 as they stand now, it's Super Bowl or bust. And that's fair to say. It sounds unreasonable before a season, but with this talent, the record, you got to figure AFC Championship game at minimum. At least winning that is certainly something that many people are going to feel at least should happen. I know Alan and I have already talked about hotel reservations and in Tampa and the Super Bowl and how many they're going to let get down there in terms of media day and the Super Bowl itself. So that's already a conversation. Juju went on a podcast, a national podcast with Peter King a week ago, and said they are already thinking about undefeated season and they feel they have to win a title or it's a busted year at this point. So that's all there and that's all real. So with all that said, they've also had some luck, and that goes into today. They face RG3, they face Trace McSorley. They face this year in terms of a litany of quarterbacks, Drew Lock, Garrett Gilbert, the 2020 version of Carson Wentz, not the 2018 version of Carson Wentz, 2020 version of Carson Wentz, Baker Mayfield, who is still a young quarterback, Daniel Jones, who also is still a young quarterback. Again, this has not been a Steeler team that has had to face Murderers Row. They have some quality wins, but they've got lucky on who they face too with who these teams are putting there under center. So what are your current thoughts of this team's viability in terms of being an elite team, in terms of being en route to that championship, and how much concern do you have by how they played? Because we hear this, you hear this from, being in media yourself. The fans get upset when they're 11-0. How could your guys are hating too much? But we're watching the game as analysts, and they're just not playing well, even though they're winning. That's just the fair criticism. So what are your thoughts now? It's another win, but it's another win off of playing poorly.
You're right. And I think I will say first, in terms of talk about the quarterbacks they've faced, this is it's similar to a talking point that we always kind of see, I feel like, in college football, with an undefeated team or something, but we see in the NFL now as well. With the Steelers, this case is you have no control over the record of your opponents, how good your opponents are, who's playing quarterback for your opponents. In some of those cases, the Steelers had to play a Garrett Gilbert or, others because they knocked out the other guy. Right. And because their defense has been so good this year, getting after the quarterback. So that's part of it. But listen, they don't call up the opposing coach. Mike Tomlin didn't call Vic Fangio and say, you better make sure that, your backup QB is ready because we're coming that through long. It doesn't work that way. You play whoever's put in front of you, and the Steelers are taking care of business in 11 games, regardless of who has been put in front of them. Now, still, that is a concern, though. A genuine concern is that they're going to eventually seem to have a collision course with Patrick Mahomes, one-time Super Bowl champ and one-time MVP, at some point this season. And we saw what he did. Believe that was it was on Sunday evening playing.
It seems like a month ago.
Yeah, it really does. We've seen every game he's played. He does the same thing every week. He just plays like a superhuman, and it's incredible. And I think what you have to key in with the Steelers defense is, do I think the Steelers offense can keep pace and score with people? I do. I think that they need to solve a lot of minor issues still. Some of the short yardage issues, I think, is a concern that has to be addressed. Now, that doesn't necessarily have to be running the ball in those situations. It doesn't have to be, having gadget plays or anything. It just means you got to convert however you do it. If you want to throw it to Deontay Johnson on a drag route 2 yards from the line of scrimmage, that's fine. He just has to catch the ball. If you want to do the same thing with Claypool, we saw him drop on a short yardage play. The guy's got to convert. It's simple as that. But when I look at the Steelers defense, because that's really where you have to contend with these quarterbacks. They've been great all year, the Steelers defense has. And when they go up against a guy like Patrick Mahomes, you think to yourself, okay, like who's guarding Tyreek Hill? Who's guarding Travis Kelce? And then who's guarding all the other guys who ran a 4-3? And that is a genuine concern. But I think the Steelers have smart, intelligent corners on the outside in Steven Nelson and Joe Hayden. I think they have probably the best nickel slot corner in football in Mike Hilton, who good to see him back out there and healthy.
Yeah.
And they have Minkah Fitzpatrick, who's one of the best center fielders, ball hawks in the game. And then Terrell Edmonds, who's I feel like really come into his own. He's almost having the season that Bud Dupree had last year.
Yeah, both underrated years.
In a lot of ways. Right. And I think what the Steelers defense does so well that's so key and could give them a chance against the Chiefs or whoever else they face down the road is you're not shutting anyone down completely in the modern NFL game, and really in football in general in the modern game, whether it's high school, college, or pro. All you have to do is just make sure you stop the bleeding, you don't let people score, and you bend but don't break. Okay, you're not going to hold Patrick Mahomes to 150 yards passing. You're not going to even hold this Ravens team, with as banged up as they were, to like 58 yards rushing. That just wasn't going to be the case. But what you have to do now in the modern game of football is you have to get sacks and you have to get turnovers. Two things the Steelers defense does exceptionally well. You're not going to full on just shut down the Chiefs offense on defense, but you can force turnovers. You can take the ball away to limit their possessions, and you can get after Patrick Mahomes and bring him down instead of letting him run for his life and create with his arm and his legs. So those are two things the Steelers defense does exceptionally well. That's obviously a hypothetical. We'd have to see it on the field to see if it actually is true in practice. Yeah. But in the modern game, those are the two things that you need to do well defensively, and the Steelers do them both incredibly well.
19-14 was the score. The preemptive NFL game, the Wednesday afternoon NFL game. I'll say this factually, the biggest NFL game on a Wednesday in Steelers history, in Steelers Ravens history. Preempted Judge Judy, preempted Days of Our Lives, and it led the Steelers to their 11th victory of the season, now moving to 11-0 on the year. Cale Berger, Mike Asti here on the Steelers edition of Pittsburgh Postgame, brought to you by SteelersNow.com, where you can go to for all of our postgame coverage that's there as we speak, actually. Alan Churning over there at SteelersNow.com. Also follow us on Twitter at PGH Steelers Now and at PGH Sports Live. make sure bottom of the video here, click subscribe. Again, free to do so. So why not? And it makes it easier to get the content to you. You get a notification whenever we go live or when anything's released. You don't even have to follow us on Twitter. You'll get the notification right there. So I recommend that as well. And yeah, that actually is something that is very, very important in terms of winning a championship this year as a defensive unit in this NFL. There's not going to be an 85 Bear 2000 Ravens defensive unit maybe ever again. This defense, despite setting the consecutive record that's going to probably be set, that they could set against Buffalo in terms of consecutive games with at least one sack, that would put them in some conversation of defenses over history. But numbers-wise, they're not near those defensive units. But it's a different game today. You don't need to be putting up the numbers they were putting up in those years of past. It's a different game, and teams are going to score points. It's just going to happen, especially when you have the MVP who's already won a championship, already has that confidence and all those weapons. So there's reason to believe there's still reason for concern in a matchup versus the Chiefs, but we have to get there first. Nothing is guaranteed, and the Steelers are winning the schedule in front of them, which I will also say, you know this too, in years past, even recent years past, no matter how good or bad this team was, they would have dropped one of these games by now. Something would have not rolled their way. They just somehow would have dropped one of these games. This is a special year where they're winning these games. They're getting the luck and somehow finding a way no matter what happens.
And maybe that's what we're talking about. They're not really winning convincingly in some of these games, whether it's this undermanned JV Ravens squad.
Nobody really is in the NFL.
Or the Cowboys game. Yeah, no one's winning like that on a regular basis. But also, maybe these are just the 2020 iteration of Tomlin games or Tomlin losses. In past years, those would be losses. This year, they're wins, but just not convincingly. So I'll take that. If you're going to still come out with the victory, but not do it convincingly, all that matters is the W or the L on that schedule after the game is played. And in terms of now, there's obviously stuff to improve upon and stuff that needs to be addressed because it will come back to bite them later on. But, maybe that is the difference with this team is that in years past, you lose to, a team like the Broncos, even with Drew Lock getting injured. You lose to this Ravens team with RG3 and Tracy McSorley. But maybe in 2020, these Tomlin losses, they've come to be called, are now just Tomlin hiccups. They're Tomlin,
unimpressive wins. But you know what what the important word there and the key of unimpressive wins? It's wins. So they're wins for Mike Tomlin. And I think what we're also seeing how great that defense was last year without an offense, because that defense last year had a pass rush and was creating turnovers at a record-setting clip. They couldn't get in the playoffs and failed only by one game. They would have got in this current format because the offense could just not move the ball.
And I think that actually really helps them defensively is because last year, they did lead the league with sacks and turnovers,
defense,
but they had to. I mean, that was the only way that they were going to win games. The only way that they were going to even have a chance at the playoffs is if the defense scored, the defense gave the offense.
It's a miracle that wasn't a 3-13 team.
Exactly. I mean, the only way they were going to win games is if the offense only had to go 35 yards to score. Right. So they had to play out of their mind every single game down the stretch, and to their credit, they did. But I think the defense is playing with so much less pressure and much less of a burden this season because they know they have competence on the other side. They know they don't have Duck Hodges and Mason Rudolph running the show. They know that they have Ben Roethlisberger. They know they have a fully stocked receiving core. And they know that, hey, like if we just make them punt here, instead of having to get a pick six that we return 60 yards, we're okay. And I think that was the difference last year was they knew they had to play above and beyond and play out of their minds the entire season to even have a chance of winning. This year, they think they're playing a lot looser because they know, okay, we just need to get stops, get our sacks, get our turnovers here and there, but we can count on the offense to pick us up as well.
Yeah, and I will tell you that Corey Geiger, who is a colleague of ours here within the Now Network and runs Nittany Sports Now, he gave me a compliment when I appeared on his radio show in Central PA that the Steelers, and as I told him, the Steelers almost made the playoffs with a guy named Duck and a GQ model running the show.
Yeah.
So
a future Bachelorette contestant. In
right. Yeah. He's winning off the field, regardless of whether or not he's playing right now for Mason. But yeah, I mean, that's definitely a point to bring up for sure. And again, they're taking care of business, which is all you can really ask of NFL teams. And nobody is playing all that well. We're really, the Chiefs have had a hiccup to this point, and nobody would have predicted that. So no one is playing perfect football. teams have had hiccups. Some have led to losses. Some have led to unimpressive wins that certainly still count as wins like any others would. And it's 2020 with a reduced off-season, a weird training camp, players not seeing each other for weeks on end. Ben had his best game of the year when he was not even at practice and was just doing it off of his iPad and watching just as much of clips as you and I did on the channel here. So it's all been odd here in 2020, but nonetheless, the Steelers are 11-0. I do want to segue, Cale, because you brought up the weirdness of this year and how nothing is perfect. And we talked about the Steelers running game earlier, and we talked about this is maybe a new Tomlin, maybe a new Ben that gets brought up a lot in these national broadcasts. They're talking about how quick of a release he has now, and before he was running all over the place. And this is now a different Ben Roethlisberger, throwing a lot more than normal. Normally, Ben of the past 51 pass attempts, you would say, that's probably a loss. It's probably a 2 or 3 interception day. That even was the case 2 years ago. When AB and Bell were there, and that was kind of the final year of that group, and Ben not there last year, obviously, with the injury. But it's been a different year for everyone. So my question is, while the Steelers running game has just not been able to get going, and it does not appear they have a true featured back, whether it be Connor, whether it be Benny Snell, whether it be even Anthony McFarland that some are now ridiculously calling for, and that's going to be the conversation every week. They've not been able to establish the run. But is that maybe not as big of a deal as like you and I and our colleagues seemingly are just always making, and it just stands out and everyone talks about? But maybe it's not true that they have to get the running game moving to win a championship, because in this NFL, we've seen recent teams win titles without a featured back. We've seen teams win championships without a running game that was the best in the league. And this is a 2020 that is a weird year. And if, as Ben said, if the game does not dictate us having to run and passing is working for us, we don't need to run just to do it. So maybe that's been a bit overblown with the weirdness of this year. Any thoughts there?
A few things. I do think that it has been overblown. I don't think that you have to run for 200 yards a game as an offense to be successful in the NFL. I think a lot of teams have proved that over the last few years. Now, some teams have had success doing that and have gotten to Super Bowls. You look at the 49ers last year, were a great rushing team, and they got all the way to the Super Bowl, ultimately didn't win. But then you look at the Chiefs. I mean, the Chiefs had a functional running game, but I don't think anyone would call it anything similar to what the Titans do in terms of running the football. So it's all about, what you want to do. And as long as you do that correctly and do that effectively, then that's fine. And I think that's the what it comes down to with the run game is if you want to throw the ball 51 times, that's fine, but you have to be successful with it. And if it's not working, then you got to try something else. 11 games in, it's worked. You haven't lost a game. But I think that, what I saw, especially in today's game, that is a little concerning to me. And you don't have to, like I said, you don't have to run the ball for 200 yards, but you have to run the ball to the extent where you can use some play action where it actually makes linebackers and safeties bite. And you have to have enough of a push up front in a run game to make it easier on yourself to get 2 yards. They had multiple short yardage situations, whether it was 3rd and 2, 4th and 1 there in the fourth quarter, where you would like in a perfect world to just hand it off to a running back and have them fall forward for 2-3 yards and you keep the chains moving. But they don't have that in their repertoire right now, especially with James Conner not out there. Now, Benny Snell is, I guess, supposed to be the short yardage back. He is very similar to James Conner. They have like the exact same body type and running style. So I don't understand why Collinsworth called him the short yardage guy. His average.
Well, Collinsworth had a rough day.
His average is so bad because they can't run the ball. It's not because he's getting carries in 4th and 1 situations all the time. But, I think that you can move the chains throwing short hitch routes and slants and drags to Deontay and Juju, but those guys got to catch the ball. You got to convert. So whatever you want to do in those short yardage situations, as long as it's working, you can stick to it. Now, as soon as it stops working, that's when you got to try something else. But I think with the run game, like I said, you don't have to run for 200 yards a game. You just have to have it be functional and have it be at least in the back of the defense's mind where they have to say, okay, there's a chance they could run this ball here. And then if you go and try to run play action, they have to think, okay, there's a chance that James Conner or Benny Snell or McFarland or whoever will get the ball in this instance. And I have to bite for at least and think just for a second. But what I was mentioning to you before we went on the air here that I do want to mention is that This Steelers offensive line is not built to be a pound you in the mouth, downhill, run the ball offensive line. They are accustomed to pass blocking. They're accustomed to not getting down in a traditional 3-point stance, and just the tackles are sitting there, kind of in their squat position. They are ready to drop back in pass blocking sets. And I think that in there, it's aging as well. I mean, I think that's a young man's game for an offensive lineman, is to go and punch someone in the mouth and really run downhill on them. I don't think this group, with the way they're currently constructed, with the way that they, in terms of their ages, is built to be a ground and pound kind of group. And I think that over the past 2 years, they've become accustomed to, we're going to throw the ball 50 times a game with Ben, and that's the way we're going to do it, and we're okay with it. That now, if you try to change who they are, you're going to get the results that you see right now. I think they're completely fine throwing the football 50 times a game because it's worked thus far, but you need to have some sort of semblance of a run game to the point where defenses have to think about it. And last thing here, and I mentioned this to you before, it's all about mindset. The Steelers don't have a run game mindset in terms of their offense.
Not
you
at
look
all.
at the Ravens, they do, because they had RG3/Trace McSorley and Gus Edwards and Justice Hill in there, and they still ran for 130 yards or something on the Steelers. Whereas the Steelers, you look at Baltimore, they had no Calais Campbell, they had no Williams there at nose tackle, they were missing linebackers, they were beat up front and had a thin defensive line, albeit no James Conner, but they still couldn't run the ball. It's all about mindset and what the mentality of your team is. The Steelers are a finesse team. They're, at least offensively. We're going to throw the ball. We're going to be finesse. We're going to use our speed on the outside. And the Ravens are a ground and pound, punch you in the mouth kind of team. That's just who they are. And we're 11 games in, and it's not going to change.
The days of the Steelers being the Jerome Bettis-led Steelers way is ground and pound are long gone. They've been gone for years, and I think it's time that fans kind of come to terms with that. This is a finesse, pass-first offense, talking about receivers that are just weapons galore, even bringing in Eric Ebron to provide more of that security blanket for Big Ben. This is a pass-happy team that is built to pass more. Eric Ebron being brought in, Chase Claypool being put on this team from the draft. They are built to do so much more through the air, even if it's short routes and sometimes running through the air. But you hit the nail on the head. They do have to have some semblance of at least keeping the defense honest, that they have a chance to run. And there have been some weeks that has not seemingly been the case. They did a little bit of that today. I do feel like that the conversation you see every game on social media is, if Connor's going up, maybe he's the feature back. You guys are too hard on him. If he's not there and somebody else is going up, clearly Snell and McFarland should be the feature back. And Connor, in all reality, the Steelers running game to have success probably needs all of those guys with their hands in and healthy and on the field, and a kind of system, maybe even a three-headed monster instead of just the two of them. That's how they're going to do it. And there's been recent teams to win championships doing it that way. They don't honestly, the way the Tennessee Titans are built, and they had a playoff run last year, that would give me less confidence over long-term success as a fan, because that is not the modern day NFL team. That is old school football. The running back does not have a long shelf life, especially when you're getting rocked 400 times a year as the featured back. I'd imagine that does not give you as much confidence for long-term success. The Steelers style can. Obviously, Ben's age doesn't give you confidence this is going to be the next decade type of situation, depending on who's in there at quarterback. But yeah, the Steelers are built for long-term success and more in the modern days NFL, which should be a good thing. Fans should like that, even though you do need to keep the defense honest.
And I will say that I liked, he only got about 3 carries, I think it was today, for 9 yards. But when I did see Anthony McFarland in there, I like what I saw. I think he provides a little bit of a burst. He provides some wiggle that the other guys in this backfield don't provide.
Right.
It's just a matter of, is he going to get those opportunities? And he really hasn't. One thing I also noticed today that is just kind of occurring to me now, and he was out there, if I remember correctly, coaching on the sideline there, but these, jet sweep and wrinkles that Matt Canada has added to this offense. He was obviously in quarantine this week or leading up to this game, but he was cleared to be there today, if I'm not mistaken. We didn't see really any of that today, if my memory serves me right. And That's something that's been a little added wrinkle to this offense that's worked, frankly, all year. I mean, I haven't seen an example where it hasn't worked. And that might not be the running backs. Usually that's Claypool getting those carries, or maybe that's a guy McFarland can factor in some of those situations. But we didn't see any of that today. But I will say I would like to see more of McFarland, because he, in a very small sample size, a significantly small sample size, because he barely touches the ball. But when he gets in there, I think he makes plays, and he does stuff that Benny Snell at least doesn't do, which is make people miss. He did have the nice stiff arm there at the end, but
you don't know how he would do, though, if he had 10 or 12 more carries in a game. That's why I do think by committee is probably the best option.
No, agreed. But I think he's had 7 over the last 3 games.
Clearly, and
more than that.
Right, and obviously Connor was the one player on both teams you did not want to see contract COVID based on his health history and having cancer. So we don't know about how he's doing or his availability in the future. That's the one player. I think, as crazy as this week was, and as much as both fan bases kind of went off the rails at times, I think that's something everyone can agree on, that was the one player nobody wanted to see contract COVID. And that, unfortunately, is a player that did contract it. So no matter how he did it, he got it. So we don't know about the future of him. But having them together is definitely the best recipe. And that was exactly what was said when I spoke with a Washington Times writer who covered McFarland in college. Nick Farabaugh, who you mentioned earlier, said that exact analysis. He has a burst, but probably better for a minimal carry load, probably can't be your feature back, but could really give you a burst and wow people off a reduced carry load as maybe the second or third guy. That's basically what we're seeing right now. So we'll see if we get more carries from
the one thing you definitely can't do with McFarland, and we saw this, was it against Dallas? I think it was. I mean, they had a 4th and 1, and they tried to hand it off to McFarland up the middle. I mean, that is offensive malpractice for Randy Fichtner to decide to call that play. That exactly. I mean, I'd rather you give it to Derek Watt, who for some reason is still on this team. I'd rather you give it to Derek Watt and get his $3 million worth and hand it to him up the middle than give it to Anthony McFarland. I mean, that makes no sense to me. But I will give Derek Watt some credit today. He was wide open in the end zone, and Ben Roethlisberger missed him.
True, what? 100%.
He could have caught a touchdown, and for a day, people would have sagged off and said, okay, we'll let you have off today, and taking a step back from criticizing the signing and this addition by Kevin Colbert. Yeah. Ben didn't throw him a bone, man. Ben had him wide open and just flat out missed him. And a single tear, man, dripped down the cheek for Derek Watt, because he almost had his moment in the sun as a full.
And honestly, that was brought up on the broadcast, and that might have been the only comment of Chris Collinsworth that was a legit comment during the broadcast. He was correct on the money on that comment. Yeah, he was wide open there, and that would have also created a Twitter firestorm, I'm sure, with JJ and TJ after the game. That would have been cool for Derek, and he was wide open there, but otherwise has not been able to do that much for this team. I will also say that it is interesting for the Steelers that they have been able to not have the running game kill them yet, but clearly it still seems to be a conversation and something out there. We still have some more chatters, and oddly enough, I'm kind of pleasantly surprised, I guess. A lot of optimistic, lack of pessimism amongst the Steelers chatters here. They are 11-0, so I guess maybe that makes sense. But a lot of this 11-0 feels so good. Steelers Nation. You can impose your will from a 2-point stance, so that's getting into something there. Bud Dupree's injury status, I will say that's going to be over at SteelersNow.com. Obviously, he couldn't return. I don't know the status moving forward, but he has been a player, and you mentioned this earlier, Cale. He had a really underrated season 2 years ago. After the year before, everybody hated him. He's still been helpful this year when in there, and there's been emergence of Terrell Edmonds. Vince Williams, I think, has had an underrated season. So this defense has so many moving parts and so many players having great years, with TJ maybe being in line for Defensive Player of the Year, that there's so much talent there that, again, lofty expectations. You're 11-0, you're taking care of business, but certainly still a concern based on how they played at times. So we will see moving forward. What I do want to get to here before we close up shop here, and we also maybe will preview a little bit of the Washington football team game, because that happens in what seems like a blink of an eye. This game, Wednesday at 3:40, that was the kickoff time. That game was the kickoff time because of the tree lighting ceremony for NBC later on in the evening that we joked was maybe going to be more entertaining than what NFL fans saw this afternoon.
Priorities.
Yeah, Judge Judy and Days of Our Lives got kicked off the air because of this game moving to Wednesday. At one point was scheduled for Tuesday just a day ago. It was moved to Wednesday here today as we're recording this. On Tuesday, it was going to be Sunday for a while, then back to last Thursday on Thanksgiving night. It's been moved all around. It was an entire week that while the Steelers game kept being moved, we saw an NFL team trek out there a quarterback that hadn't thrown a pass for years since college, with all four of their quarterbacks on the roster contracting the virus in their no mask section, trying to be go-getters and get in the practice facility when nobody else is practicing, and they end up
trying to be macho men.
Yeah, macho men and go-getters. They end up having a little spread session, and none of them able to play in the game. We've seen the San Francisco 49ers having to move their lives and their facility and their games to Arizona and play home games in the stadium of a rival. And while that's been fun for Step Brothers videos on Twitter, it's just ridiculous in reality.
Don't touch their drum set.
Yeah, that was fantastic. I did see a lot of this stuff. It did not get enough publicity because everything was just so crazy this year. But that was great between those two accounts. But in the midst of all of that, the Steelers game kept being moved. It then got moved from Tuesday to Wednesday based on rumors that John Harbaugh basically telling the NFL, hey, we don't have enough of a crew. We need this game moved competitive wise. It appears the NFL may have bended for them. We saw a positive test and Marquise Pouncey, for example, being put on the COVID reserve list the day of this game, and the NFL powering through despite positive tests and playing this game. So we got to get to this. Number one, should this game have been played this week at all? Or should it have just got so crazy that they would have had to throw it somewhere else? Should there be a week 18, which they seemingly don't want to do? And then really, number three, Raj Goodell made comments at halftime about how this was just a decision purely off safety reasons. Clearly, the Ravens could not contain the spread. They moved it to Wednesday. This seemingly was the last resort. He did admit they have to get these games in. Clearly, that's a priority for the NFL. But do you believe the bill of goods Rod Goodell is selling at halftime either? Because there's a lot to maybe lead you to believe that if it was only about safety, they probably wouldn't have suited up when hours earlier they announced the positive test and were doing contact tracing from a player that clearly somebody was around Marquise Pouncey that probably played in this game.
Well, I will say this. I think that it was definitely the right move to not play this Thanksgiving night.
Sure.
And I was saying this last week that, if you had to move it back as far as possible, but get it in this week, I thought that was the right idea, because I think the biggest issue or concern I had is, forget about the Ravens. Obviously, their own ineptitude, their own selfishness of their strength coach, who wanted to be a macho man, wanted to not report symptoms. Regardless, they brought this upon themselves by their actions. And yes, they got a little bailed out by this game getting pushed back and allowing them to have some walkthroughs and everything. They still lost the game and the Steelers still won, but whatever. But what my concern is I was okay with the game being moved back from Thanksgiving, because my biggest concern is, as the Steelers especially are trying to go undefeated here, and I'll get in a roundabout way, I'll get to this in a second, is they're trying to finish this thing undefeated. They're trying to get to a Super Bowl. I think the biggest number one concern standing in their way of doing that is a potential COVID outbreak on this team. And if they would have played this game on Thursday night, maybe even on Sunday, without getting all this contact tracing and testing out of the way and getting guys out of the lineup, then you have a risk of an outbreak on the Steelers. And then who's to say that they don't go into a game 2 weeks from now, whether it's, Buffalo coming up on the schedule, and there's no Ben Roethlisberger, there's no Juju, there's no Cam Hayward, there's no TJ Watt, no Minka. 5 guys that you cannot afford to not have are all out because of COVID. The game still goes through because somehow in this scenario, the Steelers don't get their games postponed. But when it's the opponent's COVID outbreak, it has to get postponed as long as possible. So you have a COVID outbreak in the Steelers. They end up losing a game, and then there goes potentially the first round bye, potentially the number 1 seed, and potentially the undefeated season, all because this game got played on Thanksgiving night. I think it was the right move to play it, to take your time, but play it when you could and not move it to a week 18. What am I concerned about a week 18 is the NFL and owners have already agreed to the idea of expanding the playoffs. If so many games have to get postponed or canceled or everything, if there's too much cloudiness at the finish line in terms of the playoff seeding, they'll just add another team. In that scenario, then there would be no bye. The Steelers might still get the number 1 seed, but the Steelers would not have a bye week. They'd still have to play the first week of the playoffs.
Right.
If they had to move this game to week 18 and that were the scenario, the Steelers would play week 17 against the Browns. They'd play week 18 against the Ravens, where the rest of the league, presumably, or much of the league, if they didn't have further postponements, would not play, would have a de facto bye. So 30 other teams would have a bye. The Steelers would be playing the Ravens in what might be a meaningless game at that point. They might even be 15-0. And then the very next week, you have to play an opening round playoff game, very likely also against the Baltimore Ravens, depending how their season ends. And the Chiefs, who we keep talking about, who are the Steelers are looking at from afar and competing with, would have a bye week there, presumably if they had no game postponed, and then would waltz into their bye-less first-round playoff matchup. So that would have been a nightmare scenario for the Steelers because they already got screwed out of their bye earlier in the season against the Titans. They get screwed out of an extra long week off against the Ravens here over the Thanksgiving holiday. And then you'd force them to play another week when largely the rest of the league is not having to play and then go right into the playoffs after that. That would have been absurd, frankly. And I think Steelers fans would have marched to the NFL headquarters on Park Avenue and rioted in the streets because it would have been ridiculous. And that maybe would actually be some credence to this idea that the Steelers are getting screwed by the NFL and that the NFL is out to get them. There might be some credence to that bizarre conspiracy theory. So, I think that this is the right move. You played it, you got it out of the way. You took as much time as humanly possible to get all the contact tracing and testing out of the way. You presumably have contained this outbreak as best of your ability. And now you move on. You got it out of the way. You got it over with. We're on to the next week. And we don't have to worry about it anymore. But I think a worst case scenario would be a week 18 with the Steelers likely getting the short end of the stick in that situation. As for Goodell, I thought it was very interesting that he went on there and had a little state of the NFL state of the
I think
union address.
I think he felt he had to say
well,
something.
He had to because, and I mentioned this to Alan Saunders, our colleague, earlier in the week on Twitter. He was basically saying that it was interesting to him that there hadn't been a face of this.
You need a face, right?
You need a face. And I said, I agree. I think Goodell should go out there instead of just putting out his weekly press release about how they're strengthening protocols and such, which he basically did again today. He should go out there and actually put a face to this and own it or talk about it and say, this is why we're doing this. This is our thought process. To his credit, they did today. Dr. Alan Sills did as well, the chief medical officer. They explained their reasoning. It all made sense to me. I get it. That's what I thought was the case. And then he went on there during the halftime with Tirico and had a 90-second interview during the half. So good for him that he finally put a face to all these decrees that are coming from the league office. And I think that overall it was probably the best case scenario for the Steelers long term because they got guys back. They still had some days off, and you hopefully avoid a mass COVID outbreak on the Steelers that might derail this undefeated season. And I say the undefeated season is important because the Chiefs are just one game behind the Steelers. Sure. They have one loss, and the Steelers very well might have to go undefeated to keep the number 1 seed because the Chiefs might not lose again. And if the Steelers slip up once, depending on who the opponent is, they could be vaulted by the Chiefs right away. So I think that we'll have to see in a few weeks. And I know people keep saying, "Oh, there's no threat of on-field transmission." Like, yeah, okay. I mean, they're on a pile on each other. Vince Williams is piling on the running back at the end of the half. There's a chance, but I think that they did all they needed to do. They were cautious as they possibly could be while playing football in a pandemic, and we move on to Washington.
Obviously, if large crowds can create a chance of spreading the virus even while people are being safe, then a large crowd of football players scrumming and tackling each other obviously creates a chance. Exactly. I don't think anyone can speak in any absolutes that there's no chance of a spread in any event, positive or negative. There's a chance you're always taking a risk leaving your house these days. That's just reality. I do think the game had to be moved for sure from Thanksgiving. The only pushback I will give you, though, is if Roger Goodell is saying that it was just in the interest of safety, which I don't think he's out to have anyone contract COVID or die. He certainly cares about the players' lives. And I'm glad that he went out there and spoke. I think he had to be that guy. He's getting paid the most out of anyone, so he should be the guy. And it does make it feel better that it's more the onus on him than it would be a doctor, where Dr. Fauci's become the face of COVID in general. So I'm glad for the NFL. It's Roger Goodell. He's taking it on himself. He's making the decisions. The buck's stopping with him. He's getting the big bucks.
But Alan Sills spoke with the media too.
Right, and that's true. But I'd imagine that most people are going to remember Goodell, and he's going to be the face of this now. But it's great to have medical support, which I think was necessary, because if Roger Goodell, who's not a doctor, says something, it's not going to have as much credence unless it's supported by a medical professional.
And Roger Goodell, who consistently during his tenure as NFL commissioner has made the wrong decision on many things.
And he's been very inconsistent.
And on many instances throughout his tenure. So you had to have the medical officer out there backing up these as well, because a lot of people that, regardless of what Roger Goodell says or does, I mean, Roger Goodell could go out there and say, COVID's bad, and people will be like, well, what's his motive or something. I think it was important to go out there and express that with the medical officer next to him.
So, yes, I'm with you on that completely. However, my two pushbacks are, number one, if it's just about all of that, I get moving the game, and I do, as much as I was an original proponent of Week 18 before the season, I think if you were going to do Week 18, they had to have the plan in place prior to the season and maybe moved other playoff weeks back. You certainly could have booked those hotels and moved the Super Bowl back 1 week, but if you didn't want to do any of that, or if you have to have these teams have 2 weeks off from the conference championship game, the Super Bowl, which was not the case for many, many years, but if you have to have that, which only creates another week to contract COVID, by the way, but if you must have that, then okay. You probably can't do the Week 18 now that we're 70+% in. However, you're in Tuesday. You're on Tuesday, and you make the decision to move it to Wednesday. It feels to me the decision to move from Tuesday to Wednesday, and then to not move it after you get positive tests on Wednesday, that's hypocritical. If you're moving it Tuesday to Wednesday off of just COVID, what does 24 hours really do? That's not clearly what science says. And then if you're doing it off of just positive tests coming through, then why was this game played on Wednesday when we got news of positive tests today and players who were released around the walkthrough 24, 48 hours ago? And the other end of that is, Cale, you had other teams, and as you know me, I'm not a fan of the Steelers fans saying there's a conspiracy, and the NFL is certainly not getting together in a room and saying we got to screw the Steelers somehow in the offseason. It just doesn't make sense. You could hate the Steelers, and as a business, you want the Steelers there.
I mean, they're arguably the second most popular.
Yeah, popularity, the Rooney family, the ratings. It just doesn't make any sense at all. It would just be pure stupidity, and it's just not occurring. But since there's not a conspiracy, and you don't mind the Steelers being around, the NFL is better when they are around, that conspiracy doesn't exist. So then if you're not just screwing over the Steelers, why would you allow the Denver Broncos to play without a quarterback, knowing they had 4 quarterbacks that just contracted the virus? Clearly, contact tracing could have still been an issue. Competitive-wise, it was certainly not a sound day for them. The Niners moving, having to play in Arizona. These other teams did not get the luxury that, say, was provided to the Ravens to have this game continuously pushed. And how does Wednesday make a difference compared to Tuesday if it's only about COVID? So I believe you. I don't think Goodell's a bad guy. I'm glad he went out there with medical support. But it seems like there might have been a little bit of competitive balance that was influenced by a Hall of Fame head coach, and it comes off hypocritical in a 24-hour difference.
Well, I think that definitely Harbaugh and Steve Buscemi, the owner of the Ravens, definitely had some sort of a call to Goodell's office that said, you got to throw us a bone here.
Right.
I think also the Broncos are not a playoff team. The Broncos are going to be picking in the first 10 picks of the NFL draft likely in April. And the Ravens still are very much in the playoff hunt and have a very easy schedule down the stretch.
Sure.
They're very much a playoff team. and the Steelers are as well. This is a marquee matchup. They wanted to make sure they got this thing in with as much of a what's the word here?
Legitimacy.
Yes, legitimacy as they could. I think it's also that I'm not. It's not out of the realm of possibility that the Ravens are a team that actually still has a shot at the playoffs, and the Broncos suck, and that's why they didn't really care. But I think also what Goodell described, I think in his press conference today, was that they determined that I don't think all the quarterbacks tested positive. I think maybe
his contact tracing was involved. Yeah.
They
were all together without masks.
Yeah, and then they all had high risk contact, and that's why the position group was determined. But I think they determined that it was all about containing the spread. They moved this game to Wednesday because they felt that they could best contain the spread by the end of this outbreak. And as the case numbers continued to kind of decline over the weekend and into the early parts of this week, it seemed like that was the case. Whereas with the Broncos, it seemed like it was just those guys based on their science, their medical professionals and their contact tracing, that it was maybe one quarterback had it and then high risk contact between the other ones. And they determined that they contained it within just that position group. But I don't think it's out of the realm of possibility that they said that Harbaugh and Bisciotti called Goodell and said, you got to throw us a bone here. We're a marquee franchise. We are a Super Bowl winning franchise in the last decade. I'm one of the most liked owners in this whole league in terms of Bisciotti. John Harbaugh is a guy that is not going to, he's not going to take any crap from the NFL or anything.
Right.
And when you look at the Broncos, even Vic Fangio after that game, he didn't defend his players or kind of talk back to the NFL.
No.
How could they do this to us? He was like, basically to the tune of, they should have done what they were supposed to do and they didn't do it.
Yeah,
and
it's their fault. He blamed them.
Exactly. So do I think there's some conspiracy to the Steelers or anything? No, but do I think there's a real possibility that Harbaugh and Bisciotti lobbied the league to get this thing moved back, to try and get some players back or to give them more time to prepare? I don't think that's out of the realm of possibility at all.
Yeah, I think that's what the unsettling part of this is for Steeler fans, that there's not a conspiracy against them overall. That would just make no sense. But they did get a little railroaded this week. But at the end of the day, as we said at the top, they got the victory. They can now move on from this game. Cale Berger, Mike Asti here in the Steelers edition of Pittsburgh Postgame on Pittsburgh Sports Live. And talking about moving on, we're going to kind of round things out with this, Cale. Steelers, Washington football team, that is the legal name of this team right now. The Washington football team and the Pittsburgh Steelers will play a game at Heinz Field, 5 p.m. So Days of Our Lives can broadcast. That's not going to be a concern. The soap operas still will be a concern from the daytime programming. Still a weirdness there. And as much as everybody's week was changed last week, I was supposed to be at Heinz Field covering it, and that ended up changing because of what went on. At least now we know, and the Steelers know, this is when the game is. This is when the kickoff's going to happen, barring anything unforeseen to this point, of course. So they're 11-0. It's another struggling team with another quarterback that some are going to say is not the best, that you're going to probably beat up on. But what are your keys to the Steelers versus the Washington football team? As you put it perfectly, they trek through an undefeated season, but they need to remain undefeated to have that number 1 overall seed and secure a bye, which might be very, very critical, not only normally, but because of a COVID year that still could have a weirdness of a week 18 or having other games postponed and having just odd weeks. You want that bye, and they might have to be undefeated to secure it because of how well the Chiefs are playing right now. But Steelers and Washington, what are your keys to that game?
Well, I think the number one key is, at least defensively, you have to stop the run. We've seen when Antonio Gibson, the rookie out of Memphis, has become over the last, especially 5 or 6 weeks or so, he's been tremendous, and he's really been a diamond in the rough for this offense of Washington. You have to make sure you stop him and stop the run game, and I think they'll be able to do that better against Washington than they did against Baltimore. Baltimore, like we talked about kind of off the top of the show, they know how to run on the Steelers. That's no secret. They've been able to run on the Steelers for a very long time, and they've been able to run on the Steelers this season. That's a different case with Washington. They don't have the same kind of gadget or college kind of offense. They don't run the zone reads as much, but they do have a talented running back. So you're going to have to be stout inside. If Stephon Tuitt is correct in his prediction, then he'll be back, and that should help the Steelers alongside Alualu and Hayward. In terms of other keys to the game, I think you got to get after Alex Smith. The games that they've lost with Alex Smith as quarterback are the games where teams have gotten after him. You look back to the Rams game where Aaron Donald just had a field day against Alex Smith. It was kind of terrifying considering the nature of his injury that he is coming back from. But I would expect that TJ Watt could have a similar kind of dominant performance, and that'll be big for him in his candidacy for Defensive Player of the Year, with Donald still kind of leading that charge. And then when I look at the Steelers offense, I think that you really need to keep Ben Roethlisberger upright, kind of flip it to the other side. This is a very good pass rush for Washington with Chase Young, with Jonathan Allen, with Montez Sweat. I believe Ryan Kerrigan is still there as well, a proven pass rusher. So they're a very good pass rushing team, and they're a good pass defense as well. So you're going to have to keep Ben Roethlisberger upright. You're going to have to keep him clean. He took a few shots today. The protection's been pretty good all season. They're going to have to continue that against Washington and keep him clean and hit open guys down the field and try to carve up what is a pretty stout pass defense in the Washington football team.
And at least for Washington, they have a veteran quarterback. They don't have a young, inexperienced quarterback. But they certainly do have the pass rush and have the defense that certainly could be a problem for the Washington football team. It's great to see Alex Smith out there based on what he's had to go through. And we're also going to hope for his sake that this keeps him on the football field after this game, because this is going to be a pass rush. It'll be the first test to him being back as an NFL quarterback if he can handle this and get through this game. But another game the Steelers are going to have to play better in. You would figure they're going to have to be better than they've been today, than they've been recently, to keep on this winning streak. And odds are still in the favor that they're eventually going to lose a game, which again could cause a problem. Being a number 2 seed versus being number 1 is completely different based on this new playoff format. Think of what you want, but that is the case right now. So they do need that number 1 seed. And there's plenty to criticize, but nonetheless, they are 11-0. They managed to get the victory yet again, and the Steelers get through Ravens week (S). So Ravens weeks, maybe the most asinine week in the year, certainly in the NFL this year, as crazy as that is to say, and one of the more asinine weeks the Steelers really have ever had in recent memory, again, as crazy as that is to say, with a victory. So they got the job done, they accomplished their goal, and they now can move on from the insane Ravens weeks. And now it'll be the Steelers against the Washington football team at Heinz Field. At least the Steelers get to stay home. That's big with COVID. Yeah. Obviously, if this game was in Baltimore, they might have had some of those players they were not able to travel with. So the Steelers able to stay home. Washington football team and the Pittsburgh Steelers, 5 p.m. at Heinz Field. We will have your coverage on Steelers Now. All our post-game coverage is over there at Steelers Now, including some unfortunate news about Bud Dupree. But I'll let you, if you don't already know, I'll let you go over to Steelers Now to find that out. The Steelers now 11-0 after a 19-14 victory over the Baltimore Ravens, sweeping the season series with Baltimore, at least in the regular season. And that's something that I don't think anyone really predicted before the year started. So for Cale Berger, for all of us at Steelers Now, throughout the Now family of networks, and of course, Pittsburgh Sports Live, I'm your host, Mike Asti, and the Steelers took care of business. They won. It was good enough for this game, but good enough is all it was, as I will quote Mike Tomlin to close this show.